Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Julia here from Inspira Advantage. We're a college admissions consulting company dedicated to helping deserving students get into the medical school of their dreams. Really excited to have an awesome webinar here for you today, all about the medical school application timeline. And we're joined with some really awesome panelists who will introduce themselves later. But first, I want to go ahead and get some housekeeping things out of the way. Before we get started, just want to let everybody know that we will be sending out a recording of this webinar tomorrow morning. So if you want to go back to it or if you missed something, keep an eye out for that recording. Also, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, we ask that you kind of hang on to those until our designated Q&A section, which I'll be sharing in our agenda. So hang on to those questions, and then you can type them in the chat box, and one of our panelists will be able to answer them for you when we get to the Q&A section. Okay, so for our agenda, what we're going to be talking about today, first we'll introduce our panelists. We'll be talking about understanding the medical school application timeline, the best medical school application timeline for you, crafting a compelling application, and tips for crafting a competitive application. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have our question and answer section so that you can ask all your questions that you have running throughout the webinar. Before we get started, I guess I'll let our panelists introduce themselves if you want to take it away. Richie, how about you?
Yeah. Hey, guys. I'm a third-year MD PhD student at the Yale School of Medicine. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys today.
How's it going, everyone? I'm Andrew. I'm between third and fourth years at Ohio State right now, doing a research year in Chicago at Rush University. Really excited to talk with you guys as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, guys. All right, so let's go over understanding the medical school application timeline.
Okay, so first thing of building a really strong medical school application is to prepare early. So in your pre-med years, make sure that you take a look at the recommended and required coursework for medical schools. This includes stuff like biology, chemistry, organic chemistry, stuff like that, but also make sure that you have a strong humanities background as well. And it's really important to be engaged in your extracurricular activities. Schools look for strong leadership in an application. So being involved in those activities and getting as many leadership positions as you can in college is good for your application as well.
Sorry, Andrew, if you want to take applications and deadlines.
Okay, I can continue the webinar, no problem. So the first thing that you want to work on is your AMCAS application, which is the primary application that goes out to all of the schools that you're applying to, unless I was a Texas applicant. I'm originally from Houston. So if you are a Texas applicant, you'll also have the TMD-SAS, which applies to, it now includes Baylor. So it applies to all the schools in Texas. And that application includes all of your extracurricular activities. That's where your personal statement is. That's where you'll add your transcripts and your letters of recommendation, and you can choose which ones go out to each school. And that's something that you will go over with your consultant. That's something that my students and I worked on together really closely, is making sure that every component of that primary application is as strong as possible. And after you have submitted your primary application, you have lots of secondary applications for each school. So those are going to be follow-up essays that are specific to whatever schools you're applying to. A lot of years, they repeat the secondary application. So you can actually look at what secondary applications they had previously and prepare ahead of time. And a lot of the secondary applications are actually really similar to one another. So you'll be asked the same question over and over and over again. So you can actually use a lot of your essays in multiple places.
Would you argue that the secondary application is more important than the primary application?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, I think like some of the secondary applications really show what's important to each med school. If they're really service oriented, that's usually highlighted in their secondary applications. Some of them ask for like an additional research statement, and a lot of them will ask why you want to go to that school. And it becomes really clear if you have like a really specific response that shows that you did a lot of research on that school, or if your answer is just kind of general or vague. So yeah, I would say the secondary application is really important.
Cool. Okay, so let's go over the VEST medical school application timeline. Andrew, you're back. Good. If you want to take this one away.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so starting your freshman, sophomore year, I really think this is more of a time to explore and see what you're interested in. I think that if medicine is something that you're looking to get into, obviously you want to start taking your science classes. Look at the pre-requirements for admission to medical school. Start getting in those tracks of those biology, chemistry, physics classes, but also, take some time to explore other areas, but still do well in classes, because you want to set yourself up really strongly in those first 2 years to have a high GPA when you apply for med school. And then obviously also you want to get involved with volunteer work, community service. But really it's about exploring and seeing what interests you. So during those first 2 years, I like to recommend just everyone just shooting a bunch of their shots and just figuring out what interests them. All right, and then moving on into junior year, I think when you get to this stage, you're kind of a little more focused on medicine, and knowing that's kind of that's kind of where you figure out that that's the avenue that you want to go. Start prepping for your MCAT. Keep up the GPA. I think MCAT prep, it depends kind of when you're going to apply, but I recommend having your score before you apply, just to know your complete application going into your med school apps. I think that's an important part of your app, and so you're a little in the dark if you apply primarily without your MCAT. And then obviously gaining some clinical experience, I think, is very important. If you can earlier than junior year, but junior year is a great year to do it as well. And also research. I think depending on the school that you apply to, research is becoming more and more of an important thing. Some of the higher academic schools, they really like research, and seeing that students are at least familiar with how to do research, rather than, I have this many publications, things like that. Those are all great, but it's about the experience and the skills that you learn from your research experience. All right, and then in the summer before application year, you want to have the MCAT done, and hopefully, if you take it in the spring, early summer, you'll know your score by the time you have to actually send in your application. You also want to have your letters of rec. So when you're going through those 4 years, try and think of professors that you've had during your undergrad career that you really resonated with, people who are going to know you well. I think usually it depends on your specific school. My school, we had like a committee letters. I know a lot of schools do that, where all your teachers will send in their letters to the committee, and then the committee will write you a letter as a whole. It depends on your specific school. But these letter of recs, the majority of them should be from science class teachers. So that's, biology, chemistry, physics. But if you had a major in something else that, wasn't science oriented, definitely feel free to get at least one letter of recommendation from that as well.
Cool. And we know that some schools are now MCAT optional. Do you still suggest taking that? Or maybe maybe I'm mistaken. I think that's SAT optional. But yeah, do you have any tips for taking the MCAT? Any study tips?
Yeah, I think the best way to prep for the MCAT, at least in my experience and in people who I've tutored with, is just taking practice tests and getting through the questions, getting through as many questions, seeing as many questions in as many different ways as you can. I think that a lot of people like to do a lot of content review, and I think it's helpful just for the basis at the beginning. But I think a majority of the time should be spent during doing questions, because I think that's the only way that you can figure out what exactly you do know and what you don't know. Whereas in content review, you're a little bit more like, I think I know this, I think I know this. And so it really specifies down to what you do. And then, like I said, I recommend to everyone to just know their score before they apply, because then you can kind of gauge your competitiveness as an applicant. And I think that gives you a really big advantage.
Cool, thanks so much.
Yep. And then let's see, senior year. So if you're going straight through, then this is the time to submit your primary application. It's a busy time because you also got to do your finishing senior year classes. And then hopefully you'll have a personal statement at least planned out before you start your classes. And really it should be, what I like to say is like a story, and it tells you like how you got from this person who, wasn't exactly sure what medicine was, and then you kind of learned more and more about that, and talk about your journey to decide that was the career that you wanted to do. And it's different for everybody. That's what, it's personal. That's why it's a personal statement. So there's not a good cookie cutter approach that I think works for everybody. And then as you hopefully get your interviews back, it's good to prepare for those. I think the best way to do it is just do a practice interview. So if you have somebody that will interview you, giving you questions, making you think out and speak out your answers, I think is a lot different than you just kind of writing those things out by yourself in your room. You being able to talk through your answers to those questions, to the common questions of like why medicine, and all those questions, I think is a valuable skill, and will serve you well for your interviews. And then, yeah, exactly. That last point is really important and should be highlighted, is just every school will want to know why they should, why you would be a good fit at their specific school. So whether it's location, specific programs they offer, or something else about the school that really speaks to you, definitely bring that up in your interviews, and showcase that. All right. And then, well, I guess before your interviews, you'll get secondary applications from pretty much every school after you send in your primary applications. And there are some schools that will screen before they send out secondary applications, but for the most part, you'll get secondary applications from pretty much every school you applied to during the primary. It's a really busy time because you have so many applications. Each school will send you, let's just say, around 3. It depends on each school, but around 3 3 essays to write. And so it can be a lot of work. So what I always say is, go on the internet and look up the school's essays from last year, the secondary essays from the year prior, because they like to reuse those. And if they don't reuse them, then at least you have an essay written that will be applicable for maybe another school's essay or another question that somebody will ask you. And then, let's see, spring of application year. Hopefully, you get some admissions, and you have what I like to call a good decision to make. And it's a good problem to have if you have multiple acceptance offers. I think that there's no right choice or wrong choice when choosing between medical schools anywhere. Any med school, in the U.S. is going to give you a great education. And at the end of the day, there's not really a big difference, I think, in outcomes. But it's more just what I was talking about earlier with the interviews. It's about fit and like, where do you see yourself thriving in med school? And so that's a conversation that I think you have to have with people who know you the best, and maybe can give you really good feedback about yourself, because it's hard to personally reflect sometimes. But listing out what you think is important to you. And that might not be, things that are important to the next person. So whether it's like location or, research opportunities or community service opportunities, I think those are different between each med school, and things that you have to consider.
Okay, so let's jump into crafting a compelling application. I'm sure this is what everybody is here for.
Okay, so a few important parts of your primary application are, first of all, your personal statement. Just like the name suggests, the more personal it is to you, the better. You might think that everyone has done kind of like the same activities you have, but being able to talk about your personal experiences, how you felt during those moments, what those moments taught you, really shows your reader a lot about you and who you are, and helps them figure out if you're a good fit for the school. And that's something that you'll spend a lot of time on, especially with your consultant. That's something that you'll work on for a while and like continue to work at and put away and work at again. So your personal statement is a huge part of your application. Another part of your important part of your application is being able to demonstrate that you have academic achievement. So being able to prove to that school that you're ready for the academic rigor of med school through having a high GPA, a high MCAT score. And this is also where you can list out all of your publications, all of your scholarships, any like special awards that you've gotten in school go here too. And then another really important part of your application is being able to show whatever med school you're applying to, that you've had prior experience in medicine, that you've reached out to your community and that you've gotten involved, and that you also have tried out research and have gotten involved in the medical community in that way also. So being able to show that you have adequate shadowing experience, that you've worked in a hospital, that you've worked in a lab, are all things that you can highlight in your primary application too. And a few other parts of your application. One part is your letters of recommendation. So here there are a few requirements depending on what schools you're applying to. You might need to have like a certain number of your letters be from a science professor. Usually if you're applying to like an MD PhD program or a research-focused program, you'll also need a letter from a PI. You can also get letters, and some of them also require letters of recommendation from like a humanities professor, for example. So you want to make sure that you have a good range of people that you can ask for a letter from. But the quality of the letter is also really important. So you want to make sure that that letter can really speak to who you are as a person and help build up your application. Another important part is understanding the school's mission. A lot of schools have special missions to either serve the area that they work with or to advance medicine in some way. A lot of schools have research statements as well. So being able to understand what that school is looking for in a student and what's important to them is a good way to show them that you're a good fit for that particular school. And the last part is interview preparation. One of my roommates is actually an interviewer for Yale, so I've learned a lot about what's important through her. But it's you might have an interviewer that's a med student, you might have an interviewer that's a professor, you might have an interviewer that's a PhD professor that's not in the med school at all. So being able to prepare for different kinds of interviewers and also different kinds of interview styles, like there's traditional interviews, then there's also like group interviews where you might be with other students, or there's also MMIs where you answer short ethics questions. So being able to prepare for that interview, say what you like about the school, prepare for those different kinds of interview styles is also important.
Okay, I was going to say, what a convenient roommate to have. Let's jump into tips for crafting a competitive application.
Yep. So throughout your undergrad career, you want to have a strong GPA. You want to do really well in your science courses. I think on your primary application, your GPA is actually split into an overall GPA and then a science GPA. So those core science classes, they will see how you did specifically on those. So you definitely want to focus on those. And then you want to score well on the MCAT. I think, on the MCAT, the score kind of depends on, who you are and what you're shooting for in terms of a medical school. And I think that, your target score can be up to you depending on kind of what you want out of your application cycle. So it's difficult to say, this is a good enough score, this is a good enough GPA, but it's all kind of comes down to, who you are, what your goals are, I think, in terms of, what's considered good enough. And then, like we've been talking about, getting into a clinic or, shadowing a physician is really important. Medical schools want to see that kind of what medicine is, or have an idea at least of what the field is that you're getting into. And so a way that you express that is, I worked so many hours at this ER, or I shadowed this many physicians. And, you want to show that dedication to the field. And then, like we talked about, strong letters of recommendation are very important, especially if there are people who, or professors, who kind of give letter recommendations on a scale. Sometimes there's like code words that they'll put into their letters where like this person was outstanding or this person was just good. Sometimes they do that, sometimes they don't. But the only way to really know about that is I think talking with your fellow students and seeing kind of what professors have done in the past. And then, emphasize the adversity. I think that a lot of people, sometimes will get hung up on just kind of like physical diversity, which is definitely a part of diversity, but it's also kind of, everything else that comes with it, and like how your experience was shaped by physical diversity or kind of your lived experiences. And so everybody is diverse, and it's finding your niche and what makes you unique for that medical school. That'll help you as well prepare for interviews, and then applying early. That's a big part of the application cycle. Technically, med school applications are on a rolling cycle. And so the people who, send in their primary apps first are going to be the people who get looked at first and get their secondaries first. And then you throw in your secondaries first, they're going to be the first ones to get looked at for potential interview offers. And so it's just, you want to be in there early just to maximize your chances.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much. Okay, so we've reached our Q&A section. So if you have any questions, type them in the chat box below, and we'll be able to answer those now. I see we already have a question. So Harneet is asking, what is generally considered a high GPA?
For GPA stuff, I think it's important to not get too discouraged. Obviously, doing as well as you can is important. But I think shooting for above a 3.5 is great if you're able to, just as like a general standard. But there's also this tool called the MSAR. It's like medical school admissions requirements that you can pay for through the AMC. It's not super expensive, and it shows you the 10th percentile, the 25th percentile, the median, the 75th percentile, and the 90th percentile. So you can use that to try to gauge where you are on the range of like accepted students at each school. So I think it's totally fine, and I did this too, to apply to schools where you're not in that range and just see if you get in. I don't think you should count yourself out of any situation, but that can help you make sure that you're the schools that you're applying to are balanced, and that you choose a good number of schools where you are somewhere on that range.
Yeah. Similarly, I think that you definitely want to kind of like tier your schools is kind of how I did it, and I recommend to do it is just like have your schools that are maybe kind of a shot in the dark, and then have your target schools, and then have schools that you're maybe a little bit above those statistical measures, the GPA and MCAT, just so you have like a good balanced application cycle, and you maximize your chances of getting in.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. We have a question from Donna. What would a timeline for a non-traditional student be? For example, taking a year to do a master's program.
Yeah, so I think it depends on like the master's program, on what it is. If it's something that, so I took one gap year, for example. I didn't do a master's program. I did a research program, but the research program I didn't get like a degree or anything off of that. I would say that if the master's program, finishes before, let's say like June, and you'll have the master's done by then I think that would be fine. If not, then I would probably wait to do the master's, because I think that getting applying well in a master's program might be a little hectic. It depends on the master's program exactly, but usually you kind of just follow the same month-to-month timeline. As long as you get your primary applications in by June for the cycle that you want to apply, I think you should be fine.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Andrew said. I think one important thing to keep in mind, especially for applications, is when would be a good time for you to also take the MCAT. So you're going to be submitting your applications in June if you're able to, and that might correspond with like your finals for your master's program, I'm guessing, or like once you're submitting your thesis. So it might be a good idea to schedule your MCAT maybe right after winter break where you have more time, or wherever in your master's program where you think it might be easier for you to take that. And I would recommend trying to take, because I took the MCAT super late and it made my application very stressful. So I would kind of recommend taking that maybe before April if you can, so you can just focus on your essays and your application before you want to turn it in.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. We have a lot of questions, so keep them rolling in. We have two from Erica. One, is it necessary to take the SAT? And two, do you think medicine summer camp would help?
So the SAT is required for most, well, now things are changing, like we mentioned earlier, where SATs are not necessarily required for colleges. I think that might be important in your scenario, but generally the SAT is not required for a medical school application. They're just looking for your MCAT score. And about medicine summer camps, I think it depends on what the summer camp is. If it gives you exposure to more clinical skills or more research skills, I think that would be great. But a lot of students take like summer research programs or like find things like near their house or their college or whatever and do that too. So I don't think you necessarily need to do a summer camp, but if it adds to your application, I think that's great.
Okay, awesome. We have a question from G. How can you know if your school is good enough? What's a good number of schools to, or if your score is good enough, I'm sorry. How can you know if your score is good enough? What's a good number of schools to apply to?
Yeah, so, well, starting with the number of schools, I think that's also kind of dependent on a couple things: location, how competitive your application is, and kind of what your goals are out of your application cycle. So, for example, I'm from California originally, and the California public schools, they don't give a lot of in-state preference, so it's almost like you're applying out of state everywhere. Whereas I go to school in Ohio. And at Ohio State, they do have a lot of in-state preference, so it's a little bit easier to get into Ohio State if you're from Ohio versus another state. And so I had to apply to, being from California, I had to apply to a lot more schools, I think, than I would have if I was from another state that had a little bit more in-state preference. So I think the most common numbers I would say for number of schools that I see is like anywhere from 20 to 40 schools that people apply to. So somewhere in that range would be normal, I would say. And then how do you know if your score is good enough? And I think that kind of also depends on where you want to go. If you are like focused on getting into, let's say, like a top 10 med school, then you want to be around the 520s, I guess, on the MCAT is what usually it is now. And then, but if you're, maybe just considering, any USMD school, maybe, you can lower your sights to, let's say, like a 12-ish or above. That's kind of just numbers I kind of just came up with on my head. There's no real like science to, I think, your MCAT scores, but it's kind of a picture. What I like to say is like MCAT and GP, the application kind of tell you if it lets us all know if like it fit for them. So just getting it, in through the front door is good enough.
From Shelby, you have to take to apply besides
besides the MCAT, or at least for the US schools, I think it's just the MCAT, and then you have to do your prereqs for your undergraduate courses. So usually it's like, I forget what it is now off the top of my head, but I want to say it's like 2 semesters of biology, 2 semesters of chemistry, 1 or 2, depending on the school, of OChem, and then like 2 semesters of biochem as well, or maybe 1 semester of biochem, I forget. But you have to get those core science classes down and then the MCAT.
Okay. Question from Hardeet. How do you decide what experience to discuss in your personal statement, and how many hours of volunteer, clinical, research experiences are considered good? For reference, I have about 2,000 in each category.
For which experience to talk about in your personal statement, I think that really depends on which of your experiences you think are the most important to you. I would say the experiences you talk about in your statement don't necessarily have to correspond with any certain extracurricular activity either. It's just whatever you think speaks the most highly of your preparation for med school or who you are as a person, I think would be something good to talk about. Some of the most interesting personal statements I've read, I'm also like a personal statement reviewer, so I've read like hundreds of these, are like just really unique stories that like you can tell whoever's writing it is super passionate about. So I don't think any certain activity is something that you need to write about. And as of like certain hours, I think that's really hard to judge. I think different schools are looking for completely different things. And I think standing out as an applicant is partially like how much you've excelled in whatever area you're passionate about. So I don't think that there's like a certain number that you need to shoot for. But that said, it sounds like you're really prepared. And I would say that amount of hours sounds great.
Okay, thanks so much. Another question from Gabriel. What can one do to diversify clinical experiences? Do we have to volunteer at different clinical settings every year?
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily need to go to different clinics every year. I think if you have one place that you have a good experience with, I don't think there's a problem with just going to that place over and over. But I do like to say, like, if you are only, let's say, like an ER tech or something, and you only work in the ER, I think it's good to like shadow somebody who maybe is like an OBGYN or does family medicine, to show that you're not just, you only want to do the ER and that's like the only experience in medicine that you have, just to branch out and learn a little bit more about the field. So I think it's totally fine if you volunteer the majority of your time at that one clinic, but then maybe branch out a little bit, and try and shadow somebody else somewhere else.
Okay, thanks so much. We have a question from Dylan Spira. I hope I said your name right. As a non-traditional student with a degree in engineering working for 2 years, are there any things you recommend for showing dedication / building a strong application despite a non-medical degree? Great question.
Yeah, I would just start off by saying that being non-traditional is awesome, and a lot of med schools will really value the fact that you can bring something new. I think that's part of being a diverse applicant for a med school, is having experiences that are different from other people. So I definitely wouldn't count yourself out for having an engineering degree. And I think that it would be important to like highlight how that non-traditional experience has like contributed to your decision to go into medicine, and like why you decide to take that shift, I think would be an important part of your personal statement. Could you remind me of the second part of the question again? Actually, sorry.
Are there any things you recommend for showing dedication or building a strong application despite a non-medical degree?
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I think that going off of that, it would be important to show that part of you deciding to switch career paths also includes a lot of like shadowing, for example, that what a doctor does. And that's something that you're interested, that you have like similar extracurricular and research experiences to other students, I think would also be important. So making sure that you haven't like skimped out necessarily on getting that volunteer experience and getting that observation hours in the hospital.
Okay, question from Erica. Does the recommendation letter have to be from a school teacher, or can it be from a physician who I'm shadowing?
Definitely could be from a physician. So usually it depends, but usually 4 or 5 letter of recommendations that you can get, 3 to 5 letter recommendations. I think when I applied, I had 2 science teachers, and then two science professors, 1 math professor, and then I played football, so a football coach write me a letter of rec. But if you have a physician who you're very close to, that always helps, because it's somebody who's in the field, can speak to, them seeing you in the field. And so if you're very close with them and they know you well, then that's great. But you definitely need to have at least 2 or 3 from science professors.
Okay, and last question from Harneet. Is there a place anywhere in your application to discuss or explain an outlier poor grade?
Yes, absolutely. So in your primary application, there's I think they renamed it recently, but when I applied, it was basically an area of your application where you could explain any like adverse situations that might have happened to you like while you were in college. So if there's like, if there was some major illness in your family, or if you had a personal illness or an injury or something like that, or you had to like work in college, for example, like you can explain that there. And a lot of secondary applications will also have areas where you can explain any like gaps in your schedule, where you can explain any like suspensions or poor grades or anything like that. So you can have like additional space on the secondary app too, but it varies a little bit from school to school.
Okay. Thanks so much. I think that wraps up all of our questions that we have in the chat box. Thank you so much for all the questions. They are really great, insightful questions to ask. And thank you so much for the answers from our panelists. I hope everybody learned a lot. Just want to flag again that if you missed one half of the webinar or you want to go back and revisit it, we will be sending this webinar out via email tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Other than that, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to our panelists, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Have a great evening. Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.